Thank you for inviting me out here. It's a pleasure to be here. I've had many really interesting meetings with people and more to come, so thank you very much. I also wanted to thank my collaborators, without whom, of course, this work would also not be possible, especially Timothy Smith, who, as many of you know, is a longtime collaborator of mine. Now, as many of you in this room know, both the quality and quantity of our relationships have been reliably related to both morbidity and mortality rates. Okay? And for example, in the Holt-Lunstad and colleagues meta-analysis, they found that perceived support was associated with greater survival. And importantly, many of these studies controlled for standard variables like demographics and health behaviors. Okay? And this is a figure I like a lot from their review. The first three are from their overall meta-analysis. The first one is overall, second one is measures of perceived support, and the third is our more complex measures of social integration like Lisa Berkman's social network index. Okay? And what they did is they plotted this against other standard biomedical risk factors, meta-analyses from those areas. As you can see, the link between relationships and health are comparable, if not larger, than more standard biomedical risk factors like smoking and physical activity. Okay? Now, despite this evidence, we also know that not all relationships are uniformly positive as well. Okay? And so, consistent with this would work better around February, but I still like it a lot. So, a smaller but growing epidemiological literature links negativity in relationships to higher rates of mortality as well. Okay, so positive relationships are good, negative relationships are bad, at least for health. Now, what I want to do today then is give you a broad overview of our program of research on positivity and negativity in relationships that we think can inform this epidemiological research, especially in terms of moderators and mechanisms. Okay? And so I'm first going to talk about a couple of really new studies in the lab, not published yet, factors influencing the social support and health link. Okay? I'm then going to talk about a recent study that just came out looking at negativity in relationships and its links to health relevant outcomes. Okay, I'm echoing. And then finally I'm going to talk about, after that I'm going to talk about a broad integrated model of relationship positivity and negativity that looks at both of these dimensions simultaneously, or what we call ambivalence in relationships. And then finally, we're going to talk about some intervention implications in a small pilot study that we just conducted. Okay. Okay. So for this first study, this is one we just recently completed. It's based on the stress buffering hypothesis of support. So basically, support is beneficial for health because it reduces harmful biological reactions during stress. Okay. However, of course, a lot of people have argued that there's some very important contextual factors that are important in whether or not support is effective, especially receiving support. Okay? And so one thing we looked at that had been hypothesized to impact this link is anxiety on the part of the support provider. Okay? And so we know that anxiety can interfere with the retrieval of more complex social skills, and so it's possible that an anxious support provider is really not a very effective one. Okay? And this is actually not a very new idea. This is proposed by one of your colleagues, by Lehman and colleagues in 1986. And I've always been really interested in this idea. I thought it was a really good idea. But we just recently came around to doing a study on it. Okay? And so in this study, we had 74 gender-matched dyads. They were randomly assigned to a two-support role, either be the provider or the recipient. And those providers were in turn randomly assigned to a high or low anxiety condition. Okay? And the provider anxiety was manipulated by highlighting an evaluation of their support providing skills. Okay? And the recipient simply spoke about an important personal problem, and of course they were blind to the provider anxiety condition. Now, we had measures of cardiovascular reactivity during the discussion task, and of course cardiovascular reactivity predicts future cardiovascular problems. Okay, so first of all, our manipulation checks worked out pretty well in the sense that high provider support anxiety was associated with greater arousal, less ability to cope, and also greater declines in state self-esteem. Okay? Now, importantly, we also found that high provider anxiety was also associated with greater systolic and diastolic blood pressure reactivity on the part of the whole dyad. okay? And so as you can see here, in the green bars are the high anxiety provider condition, the blue bars are the low anxiety provider conditions, and they showed heightened both systolic and diastolic blood pressure reactivity, okay? Now importantly, there was no interaction with the support role, either being the recipient or the provider, okay? Suggesting that both providers and recipients in that condition showed heightened cardiovascular reactivity, okay? And of course, these data suggest that interacting with an anxious support provider may interfere with the stress buffering influences of social support, okay? And this is a pretty new study. We have a lot more data we need to look at. And one of the things we're really interested in is we have some behavioral, we have videotapes of their interactions. And so we're very excited to go back in and videotape, or not videotape, but code those interactions in terms of both what the provider is doing and what the recipient doing in terms of supportive behaviors and negative social exchanges, okay? So that will be forthcoming in the near future. Now, in this study, we again tested the stress buffering hypothesis of social support, but we focused on a different contextual variable, and that is choice in receiving support. This has gotten a lot of attention recently, as some people like Bodra and Amaral have argued that choice in receiving support may be particularly important, because if people just provide you with support, it's unsolicited, that threatens your sense of esteem and independence, okay? So that may be associated with harmful effects of actually receiving support. So we tested this idea in 2 studies, okay? Study 1, we had about 82 people. Participants were support recipients who had to perform a speech stressor to a confederate, okay? And in the choice condition, essentially participants were allowed to self-select to receive support or not, okay? So they were randomly assigned to have choice or not, and they could say whether or not they wanted support or not, okay? So they self-selected into receiving support based on their preference. Now, in the second study, we did 118 undergraduates, again, very similar paradigm. And in the choice condition, we actually manipulated choice via an induced compliance paradigm, okay? So basically, in these paradigms, what you would do is you tell them, well, you've been randomly assigned to receive support. However, it's really up to you, okay? I mean, if you really don't want to do it, it's okay, but it would really help us out. Is it okay if you choose to do this? And overwhelmingly, of course, people say, yes, it's okay, okay? And so they have the illusion that they have the choice there in receiving support. Now, first of all, in both of these studies, manipulation checks worked out perfectly fine. Choice is associated with greater perceived choice in receiving support. Now, importantly, however, in both studies, we found choice in receiving support was unrelated to cardiovascular reactivity, okay? And these are the, just for one, these are like the means that look the best, but all of them are not significant, and they're not across any of the measures, okay? As you can see in study 1, in the green bars is the choice and support, and the blue bars are support and no choice, so unsolicited support. And across both of these, even with study 2, you can see with those 95% confidence intervals, there's virtually no link between choice in receiving support and actually benefiting from that support as well, okay? And so our conclusion is, I've always thought that that was a really interesting, important idea, that choice in receiving support might matter a whole lot, but we don't find good evidence so far of this in the studies that we have conducted, okay? So perhaps maybe choice in receiving support may not be a dominant factor influencing its effectiveness, or may be moderated by other factors like the quality of the relationship, perhaps, okay? So, so far we don't have good evidence that one of the reasons why receiving support is bad is because it threatens your sense of esteem or independence. That we don't seem to be finding that in these 2 different paradigms that we've used. Okay. So now I want to talk about a recent study just came out in Health Psychology, looking at negative relationship processes and looking at cellular aging, okay? So by looking at negative social processes, we tested what's called the social control model of social support. And basically, it argues that social support is beneficial for people because other people can put social control on you to behave in a more healthy fashion, okay? So they can tell you should exercise more, you should eat better, etc., okay? And that should be related to positive effects on people's health. Now, The other side of that, however, something called the dual effects model of social control, is that, yeah, that might happen, but it may be bad in the sense that it also increases levels of perceived stress, because people don't like being told what to do, okay? And so that's called the dual effects model. And social stress, importantly, is particularly detrimental for people, as shown in both animal and human models, okay? So it looks particularly bad social sources of stress. And so whenever I've thought about the social control model, I've always seen this paradox here, and that is, can the healthier behavioral change elicited by social control, can that offset the potential negative effects of interpersonal stress to overall produce a healthier outcome, okay? I just wasn't certain. So we had the opportunity to test this in one of our data sets. And so we had 140 middle-aged to older adults who completed measures of total network social control regarding their health behaviors, healthcare utilization, and lifestyle. And we had measures of telomeres, which provide an index of aging at the cellular level, okay? And importantly, it's related to a number of different disease outcomes, so it provides kind of a broader index of disease risk, okay? Okay, so consistent with the social control hypothesis, we did find that total network control was related to greater levels of perceived stress overall, okay? But we found inconsistent effects on their health behaviors. So sometimes we found it was related to healthier behavioral changes, but most of the time we actually found it was related to negative behavioral changes, more consistent with the reactance hypothesis, okay? And sometimes we found it was unrelated to behavioral change. Actually, we're a little surprised at first, but when you look really closely at the social control literature, it's a little bit all over the place. It's only there on select measures, and I can't quite figure out what the moderators might be. So it's not as consistent as that model would appear to suggest, okay, at least in terms of health behavior change. But we did find it related to increased stress. Now, importantly, for our main question that we're asking, when you control for the things you need to control for, we did find that total greater network control was related to shorter telomeres, okay? And our estimates based on the amount of telomere shortening was their cells were aged anywhere between 5 to 10 years more, to the extent that they were higher in levels of social control, or they were subject to more levels of social control, okay? And these results were unchanged when considering things like self-rated health, or even personality factors that might influence our reactions to social control or our interpretation of that information, like trait hostility and trait optimism. Now, of course, the big thing we got in the review process, of course, is it's cross-sectional design, so it's very, inferences are difficult to make. But we believe it may be indicative of a more cyclical model of social control, okay? And we're going to collect some longitudinal data to tease this out. And that is that we think that social control is initially elicited by a perceived or actual health threat to a close other, okay? It doesn't have to be that they're sick, but just if you perceive that their health behaviors may end up eventually costing them something. So that elicits social control, and if the person is unable or unwilling to change their behavior, then that may result in more chronic interpersonal stress, which then we believe has negative biological and health-related outcomes, okay? So we certainly need more data on this point, but it's a really interesting hypothesis because it starts to integrate the basic research on social control and health behaviors with biological endpoints as well, which to this point hadn't been done consistently, okay? Now, you know, I've argued that both positivity and negativity are important to look at in terms of relationship processes and their links to health. Now, we've also been very interested in asking the question, what about both? What about relationships that have both positive and negative aspects, okay? And so we proposed quite a while ago, it seems like just yesterday, but this framework for looking at positivity and negativity in relationships. So here you have positivity ranging from low to high, negativity ranging from low to high, and we can classify people based on their relative negativity and positivity, okay? And so in the high positivity, low negativity corner are what we call supportive network ties. These are your confidants, just people you can't live without, okay? That's how we view them. In the cross diagonal are just the opposite kind of people, okay? High in negativity, low in positivity. They're usually there because of constraints to your social network, but they're still there, like they could be coworkers, maybe in-laws, etc. Okay? In this low corner are what we call indifferent network ties or social acquaintances, usually characterized by low depth or frequency of interactions. And what we've been particularly interested in are individuals in this high corner, or what we call ambivalent network ties. Could be a volatile romance, a competitive friend, an overbearing parent, or we feel any relationship that in the past has had both positive and negative elements or experiences with them. Now, we've measured this using what we call the Social Relationships Index. People are asked to list 23 network members, a spouse or romantic partner, parents, other family, friends, coworkers, and social acquaintances. The latter 4 categories are limited usually to 5 people to keep it reasonable in terms of completion rate. And then rated in terms of how positive and upsetting they are. Okay? And we usually characterize or operationalize supportive ties as no upsetting quality, some positivity, aversive ties, some upset, no positivity, and ambivalent ties, a little bit of both. Okay? And we've adopted this threshold model because typically what you see is a real constraint in how people are willing to rate negativity in their relationships. And so we almost have to take this threshold approach in looking at trying to categorize people. But what we find when you move the threshold up, especially for supportive ties where you find, or positivity ratings, when you find a wider range, you still find the same thing. Okay? So here's an example from one of our study on friendships. This is 2 friends. As you can tell, friend number 1 is rated as very supportive. They're rated as very positive and also not at all upsetting. Whereas friend number 2 is rated as quite ambivalent. Okay? They're rated as, again, very positive, but also moderately upsetting. Okay? And let me make an important conceptual and operational point that I usually make with this research, and that is, if you were only looking at positivity in relationships, these 2 friendships would look exactly the same. Okay? But what's underlying these relationships in terms of negativity is quite different and can only be got at, of course, by looking at separate assessments of relationship positivity and negativity. Okay? And we think this is really important for looking at relationships in health. Okay, our psychometric properties, we've done a lot of work on this as well. We get 2-factor structure of relationship positivity and negativity. The longest we looked is 3 months, but they look pretty stable except for aversive ties, albeit it's still significant. In terms of convergent validity, it's related to the quality of relationships index, support and conflict subscales like you would expect, the Pearson-Saracen measure that's widely used. And discriminant validity, it's separable from personality measures of trait hostility, trait negative affect, as well as trait positive affect. Okay? So as I mentioned, we've been particularly interested in ambivalent ties because most of the prior work has looked at positivity and negativity separately. So these are relatively new types of relationships, we believe, at least in the health domain for people looking at relationships in health. So what's the evidence that these relationships exist? Well, certainly there's anecdotal evidence. Okay? Here's some quotes. Here's quotes taken by Michael Jackson fans one day after his passing. I loved Michael Jackson. I hated Michael Jackson. I admired him. I was ashamed of him. I was sorry for him. I was proud of him. Clearly reflecting, I think, the ambivalent feelings that many people had about Michael Jackson. Gore Vidal, the playwright and activist, said that whenever a friend succeeds, a little something in me dies. I can't relate to that, but obviously people can. And then George Burns has said, happiness is having a large, loving, caring, close-knit family in another city. Okay? And my own personal favorite, just because it is very personal to me, is I was going through my every so often you go through your high school yearbook. At least it's me. And I was going through and looking what people signed, and actually my best friend signed this about me. He said, was nice knowing a choice and annoying friend like you over the years. Okay? And choice is kind of an 80s term, but basically it's a positive thing. Okay? But clearly I was a source of ambivalence towards my best friend. Okay? And I'm actually still, he's still one of my best friends. And every so often I'm tempted to like go over his house and give him, can you fill out this SRI for me and just make sure I'm not in that category, but I'm hoping I'm not. Now, what I wanted to do is show you a clip of what I believe to be a really good example of an interaction with people who already have established ambivalence, okay? And so I don't know how many of you have seen this movie. It's Walk the Line, the Johnny Cash story. And in this scene, what's happening is that in the story, of course, Johnny Cash has my perception is he has very ambivalent relationship with his dad, which is pictured here, okay? That's his mom. And they're having a dinner at his house with his family and then his girlfriend's parents, okay? And if you look at the kinds of interactions that occur in terms of him seeking support from the dad, you'll see what I think happens in ambivalent ties. Ooh, I don't know how I'm going to start this. Ooh. Many of you have seen this movie know that part of that ambivalence stems from a very harsh early family environment he experienced with his dad, okay? And in fact, I'm going to show you a theoretical model that takes into account some of that stuff. But I think that's the way some of these ambivalent interactions play out over time. And whenever I'm watching movies, I'm always looking for like really good scenes. So far, this is the best I've found. And if you keep watching this movie, of course, he goes berserk in a couple of minutes and starts driving the tractor all over the place. Not getting mad at his dad, but just really letting out and kind of trashing this tractor that he has. Because earlier, his dad didn't approve of the tractor. The dad was saying, why would you spend so much money on this, and so forth. So more of the same. But clearly, I think ambivalent ties exist. And so the next question is, how prevalent are they? Okay, how frequent are they in people's networks? Well, this is representative of one study we did with undergraduates. But we find the same thing, community samples, older adults, et cetera. And as you can see, roughly about half the people are sources of support, which you might expect, okay? But what surprised us at first, but we find time and time again, is roughly about the other half of people in their social networks are sources of ambivalence, okay? With a small number of aversive ties, and also a small number of indifferent ties, the latter being more a measurement issue, because we can only assess so many relationships, okay? Now, we also find this in marriages, okay? We started doing a lot more work on marriages now, and across a number of our studies, at least, if not more, than 50% of people view their spouse as sources of ambivalence, okay? In one study, we found as high as like 80%, okay? So clearly, we believe then that ambivalent ties are not an isolated feature of most people's social networks, and hence we feel like there's ample opportunity for them to influence the kinds of health-relevant outcomes that we're interested in, okay? The kinds that develop over a long period of time, but even those that get exacerbated when they already have a chronic condition. Okay, so this is a lot, but I'm just going to kind of highlight certain parts of this model. This is a model that my former student Julianne and I have been working on during the past year, okay? And basically, a lot of this the work in the top part here comes from the sociological literature, especially in regards to intergenerational relationships, so parent-child relationships, okay, especially parent and adult-child relationships. And the bottom part comes from a lot of our work that I'm going to go over in a little bit, okay? But starting at the top, we think that there are predisposing antecedent processes that are more likely to lead to perceptions of ambivalence in particular relationships, okay? And one of those are conflicting norms, especially in the context of developmental transitions, okay? And so a good example of that is that there are expectations that individuals' parents have towards their adult children. And when they fail to meet those expectations that are governed by norms, societal norms, then perceptions of ambivalence become heightened. So for example, an adult child who fails to reach financial independence is often associated with perceptions of ambivalence on the part of the parent, okay? So that's one example. In addition, the early family environment also appears quite important. And so I was just telling you about in the Johnny Cash case, it was a really harsh early family environment he experienced with his dad. And indeed, there are longitudinal studies suggesting that to the extent that individuals are from more conflictual or from a harsher family environment, that's associated longitudinally with greater perceptions of ambivalence by the adult child in regards to their parents, okay? It's not aversion, it's more ambivalence because there's still this positivity there, okay? Now, once those processes play out, and there are a number of other ones, and I can go over them if you're interested in later, there are processes that we believe maintain relationship ambivalence because it's so pervasive in people's relationships, okay? And those have to do with the following, but I'll just go over two of these as well. First are internal barriers, okay? So for example, Julianne Holt-Lunstad did a study on why we keep those annoying friends, where she basically asked people, what are the reasons why you keep certain friendships? And it was people who are rated as ambivalent or supportive. And these are friendships, so they're voluntary relationships. And she found overwhelmingly that people keep these relationships primarily due to internal factors. Things like you feel a sense of commitment towards them, or you feel like in some way the positivity may make up for the negativity, okay? It wasn't because of they were in your same friendship circle and you didn't feel right about cutting them off or anything of that sort. It was more these internal processes that were important. There are also coping strategies that we think help maintain relationship ambivalence over time. And so when people report, like people have been asked, how do you cope with these ambivalent relationships? And oftentimes people report things like discounting their behavior, lying to them, withholding information, etc. Okay, those are all more indirect coping strategies that really reduce what's sociologists call the transformative potential in those relationships, and that is the potential to make them more positive. Because after all, they can't change their behavior if they don't know it's bothering you. Okay, and yet people report kind of indirectly coping with those relationships in that manner. Okay, so after those processes are maintained and we get to the point where we have a lot of these ambivalent ties in our network and even some of the more important people in our lives, we think there are important interpersonal mechanisms that link them to health, including things like contact frequency. So as I mentioned, there are lots of these people, and with the people we have a lot of contact with. That leads to stress enhancement because these ties are inherently less predictable, okay? And to a certain extent, when they upset you, it means a lot more because there's usually overlap between self-other representations that potentiate your response to their kind of, to their behavior. There's also what we call support interference in the sense that people are less likely to seek support from ambivalent ties, but even when they seek it, the quality of the support, it's like certain zones I end up echoing. Even when people seek support, they tend to get poorer quality support, okay, from these individuals as well. In turn, it impacts, we think, health behaviors and treatment cooperation, although we certainly have less evidence that that is a crucial or important mediator. And then we postulate there are important effects on biological mechanisms like the CNS, the autonomic, endocrine, and immune systems. Okay? And finally, it would translate to either acute or chronic disease outcomes. Now, when we first started this program of research on ambivalence in health, virtually we couldn't find anything. We couldn't find any studies looking at this question. Okay? And so we had competing hypotheses. On the one hand, is it possible, I mean, people seem to keep these relationships, so is it possible that people actually benefit from the positivity that exists in these relationships? Maybe, okay? On the other hand, however, these ties may be particularly harmful because they're less predictable, they increase levels of interpersonal stress or vigilance during social interactions, all of which may potentiate people's biological responses during these kinds of interactions, okay? And overwhelmingly, our very early work found support for the latter. And that is, we don't see, at least in the context of health-related consequences, that people are benefiting from these ambivalent relationships. If anything, it's harming them, okay? In the sense that interactions, and we did one daily diary study very early on, and we found that when people were interacting in the real world with an ambulatory blood pressure monitor, when they were interacting with people they normally perceived as high in both positivity and negativity, they showed the highest levels of ambulatory blood pressure during those interactions, even compared to aversive ties, supportive, and indifferent ties, okay? In addition, when we bring this phenomenon into the laboratory, and the way we usually do this is we ask people to rate different kinds of relationships, and we have them bring an ambivalent friendship into the lab. We randomly assign them to bring an ambivalent person or a supportive person. We find that's usually related to greater cardiovascular reactivity in a support-seeking context. So when you try to get support from them, reactivity is heightened, okay, as a function of that particular relationship. And so some of the current work that I'm going to talk to you about are some of my very favorite studies. And they really focus on more specific processes and contexts, and I think are helping us understand some of the more specific pathways that might be involved here. So here's one of my favorite studies. This is a study we published a couple years ago. And a lot of the prior work in this area had looked at more conscious or actual interpersonal interactions associated with relationships. So we bring couples in and we have them argue, or we bring friends in and we have them provide support, okay? But actually having them interact with each other. Now the question we ask here is, can automatic activation of relationship representations influence cardiovascular activity during stress that's independent of any actual or consciously perceived interactions, okay? Now in this study we had 106 participants. They completed their SRI in time 1, and approximately 2 or 3 days later they were randomly assigned to come back to subliminal priming with the names of either supportive ties, ambivalent ties, aversive ties, or indifferent ties. Okay? We had 75 trials with 25 filler items. And they were primed for about 43 milliseconds in mass. This was based on prior work, of course, in priming, and then also based on pretesting. They then performed self-relevant stresses where cardiovascular measures were obtained. Now, less than 1% of primes were correctly recalled in the study, which is well below the threshold considered for subliminal priming studies. Okay? And so we did a 2 positive relationship prime by 2 negative relationship prime ANCOVAs, controlling for baseline levels, although when you don't control for it, you find the same thing. And the first thing we found was a negative relationship prime main effect on diastolic blood pressure reactivity. And what we found essentially is that when people were subliminally primed with the names of individuals in their network who were sources of negativity, they showed higher diastolic blood pressure reactivity during stress. Okay? Now importantly, we also found the predicted positivity by negativity interactions on cardiovascular reactivity as well. And as you can see, when people were subliminally primed with relationships that were high in both positivity and negativity, they showed the highest levels of heart rate reactivity and greater parasympathetic withdrawal during stress as indexed by respiratory sinus arrhythmia. Okay? Now importantly, the subsequent analysis showed that RSA mediated the impact of ambivalent ties on heart rate reactivity, suggesting a parasympathetic substrate for that particular effect, and that's important because it suggests a couple of psychological processes that might be going on based on current theoretical models. Okay? So for example, it may reflect the possibility that ambivalent ties negatively influence self-regulatory processes, okay, because there's a lot of work going on now linking RSA to self-regulatory capacity. Alternatively, it's possible that ambivalent ties may simply trigger an early state of threat processing in which the first response is to let up on the quicker parasympathetic break. Okay? However, more generally, I really like this study because these data suggest the quality of people's relationships can have more subtle and perhaps widespread influences on health-related outcomes than has been appreciated. Okay? Via subtle reminders that are out there in our daily environment. I mean, from names you hear, or you may see on a billboard, or pictures of people that you may look at. Those may all act as subtle subliminal primes that may impact physiology in very subtle but potentially health-relevant ways. Okay, and I think a good example of this is, I think all of us, right, we bring pictures of our loved ones into the office, right? Just about everybody's office, I saw their kids and their family, et cetera. And that's one good example of how that can work, okay? And so the only advice I would give you, however, is based on the study, make sure that they are unconditionally supportive people, okay, that are in your office, because that's priming you on a daily basis. Okay, in this next study, this was also recently published, most of our work is focused in a support context because I started as a basic social support researcher. I still do that work, of course, but basic social support processes. So I thought that was an important context to look at ambivalence. Okay, but of course there are other more specific contexts that are important from a relationship science perspective. Okay, which I'm getting more drawn into because I think it's a really important area that's going to really be important for health psychology and for relationships and health work in the future. Okay, but there are two different other contexts that are important from that perspective. One is what's called sharing positive events. So Shelley Gable refers to this as capitalization. So basically when something goes well for you and you tell someone, then they can make you feel better by being excited along with you, right? Or of course, maybe not make you feel so well by one-upping you or not acting very enthusiastic about what happened, okay? But she argues that's a very important interpersonal context as well, and perhaps more important than support, because she argues that it happens more often than our dealing with negative events, okay? So she thinks that's more important. The other context is just routine daily interactions that we have with people. And so this is based on Brian Lakey's relational regulation model. Basically argues that the primary way that people self-regulate is by these daily mundane interactions that we have. And so what he calls water cooler talk. Okay? And that's the way people maintain their mental health over long periods of time, is these mundane daily interactions. Okay? But he hasn't really said anything about effects on physical health, and so I thought I would test it anyway, and so forth. Now, we had 94 couples, had their blood drawn and completed the SRI in 3 different contexts, okay? The 3 different ones that you see there. We looked at inflammation as a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and we used PROC mixed to control for age, gender, body mass, and medication use. Now, the first major finding was when you look at the support context, which is where most of our work has been, perceiving your spouse as a source of ambivalence during support was related across the board to higher levels of inflammatory cytokines. Okay? It was related to higher IL-6 and fibrinogen levels, as well as marginally higher CRP levels. Now, we also found that perceiving one's spouse as a source of ambivalence during capitalization was also related to higher fibrinogen levels only, but it was much weaker. And when we make support and capitalization compete in the same model, capitalization falls out, and it's only support that remains, the support context that remains. Okay, I was kind of disappointed in this because I really like relational regulation theory, but daily life context was unrelated to outcomes. And I know I emailed Brian, and he was disappointed as well. But he hasn't really made predictions in terms of physical health, so I guess he was okay with that. Now, importantly, we did some follow-up analyses because we wanted to take into account alternative explanations, et cetera. And we found that results for perceived spousal ambivalence during support and inflammation across the board held while considering people's health behaviors, relationship-specific attachment styles, so even considering attachment, anxiety and avoidance from that particular romantic relationship. So it's not serving as a proxy for attachment style. Spousal positivity and negativity separately, those ratings on their own, as well as overall marital satisfaction, okay? Suggesting there's something unique about being able to look at the co-activation of both positivity and negativity in relationships that are not being captured by these broader assessments, okay? And so there are a couple mechanisms that we think might be operating. One is what we call support interference that I talked about, and that is people are less likely to go to these individuals for support, okay? And especially within a spousal context, that's a very important adult relationship, okay? But even when they get support from those individuals, there's evidence that they can cause additional stress for you above and beyond what they're stressed about in the first place, okay? So we did a study where we had people bring in ambivalent ties, friendships, and then we had them interact, and we videotaped their interactions, okay? And independent raters rated the behavior of those ambivalent friends as being more negative in terms of criticizing, as well as providing less or worse quality support, okay? So above and beyond whatever problem you're dealing with, if you go to these individuals, they can potentially make you feel worse about the problem and yourself. Okay. I want to talk about a couple of studies now that represent the real future direction of our lab. And this shouldn't be new to everyone here because Anita has been such a big person in this area doing this kind of work. But we're really starting to focus a lot more on these dyadic analyses and dyadic studies, okay? And this is something, again, based on the relationship science perspective, I think will be really important for relationships and health work. And largely, it's not there in the kind of physical health work that we do. Okay? So I think it's really important, and we're probably going to do just about every study we can now using this perspective. But our prior studies, of course, don't consider the inherent dependency of individuals within close relationships. And of course, such interdependence can be modeled more formally using actor-partner analyses. And in our case, the question becomes, for actor influences, does an individual's perception of their spouse predict their own outcomes? For partner influence, does a partner's perceptions of their spouse predict one's own outcome? And actor by partner influences, does a couple's combined perception of each other predict one's own outcome? And so here's a study we had that we completed. Had 136 older couples from the Utah Health and Aging Study. Long-term marriages, on average of 36 years they were married. And we had measures of coronary artery calcification, basically a non-invasive measure of the extent of calcification in the coronary arteries that are correlated with plaque buildup, okay, and hence a robust predictor of future cardiovascular risk. We did actor-partner models using ProcMix, controlled for the things you need to control for. And first of all, we didn't find any separate actor by partner links, okay, with calcification. However, we did find an actor by partner interaction in predicting CAC. And as you can see, when both actors and partners perceive their spouse as being a source of ambivalence, that's where we found the highest levels of coronary artery calcification. Okay? Now, importantly, these links were still significant while controlling for basic risk factors like smoking. Also, we had a lot of good blood work in the study, so we had cholesterol levels, et cetera. Doesn't seem to matter. Again, ratings of spouse positivity and negativity, and again, overall marital satisfaction. Okay, again, suggesting there's something unique about looking at the coactivation of positivity and negativity. Okay. Okay, and this is probably one of my favorite studies, just because it's so different. It's kind of a different way of thinking about relationships, at least on the physical health endpoint. Certainly, there's some of this kind of work actually going on right here. But prior work certainly suggests that social interactions that occur outside of the home can influence interactions that occur inside of the home. Okay, called affective spillover. Rena Rapetti and colleagues have called it affective spillover. And so, you know, you're at work, you have either increased levels of stress, like Anita's work, or you have just negative interactions at work. Okay, you come home, you're more likely to withdraw from your partner, and you're more likely to anger quickly. Okay, and certainly people have shown that that can affect people's mood states. Now, the question we asked here is, can it also impact health-relevant biological processes? Okay. And so we had 94 married couples who completed the SRI and underwent 1 day of ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. Okay. And we did, again, actor-partner analyses using ProcMix, controlled for all the basic ambulatory variables you need to control for. And the first thing we found is we replicated our prior work on actor influences. So to the extent that you had more ambivalent ties in your network, you had higher levels of ambulatory blood pressure. To the extent you had more supportive ties, you had lower levels of ambulatory blood pressure. Okay? Now, importantly, we also found a number of partner influences as well. And so the degree of support, the number of supportive people your partner had was related to lower levels of your own ambulatory blood pressure. The higher number of purely negative ties your partner had was related to higher levels of your own ambulatory blood pressure. And the higher number of ambivalent ties your partner had was related to higher levels of your own ambulatory blood pressure as well. Okay? Now keep in mind, these are actor-partner analyses, so these partner effects are all independent of your own actual social network characteristics. Okay? And in fact, when you put all of these in an equation, they actually are quite independent. Okay? They're not serving as a proxy for other, for similar variables in there. They're relatively independent predictors. Your spouse's social network characteristics predict your own outcomes pretty independently. Okay. Now, we also found a number of actor and partner interactions as well. Okay. And so these are plotted here just for systolic, but we pretty much found it across both systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And as you can see, when both members of the dyad had a low number of supportive ties, they showed the highest levels of daily ambulatory blood pressure. Okay? When both members of the dyad had a relatively high number of aversive ties, they also showed the highest levels of ambulatory blood pressure. And when both members of the dyad also had relatively high levels of ambivalent ties, they also showed the highest levels of ambulatory blood pressure as well. So a couple of mechanisms that we think might be operating that we're going to follow up on is, first of all, this notion of increased affective spillover, because certainly the kinds of interactions that happen outside of the home, so interactions that your spouse may have with their social network, may in turn influence home interactions that occur, okay? I think it's also possible, especially for the case of aversive and ambivalent relationships, that these kinds of relationships that your spouse have might also trigger defensive anger on your part. After all, none of us like seeing the ones we love being treated badly. Okay, so your partner tells you something about, and that would upset you, right? That this person is treating someone you love badly. It's also the case that low supportive ties especially may deny couples access to coping resources or deplete their self-regulatory capacity as highlighted by social baseline theory, okay? So whenever I think of this study, there's this title in the prior literature with a fancy title that says, "No couple is an island." And I think it's certainly true that couples are certainly dependent on one another, not just on one another, but it looks like the characteristics of their social networks are also quite important, okay? Okay, so summary and implications so far. Positive relationships are protective of health, and negative relationships detrimental to health. The joint influence of positivity and negativity or ambivalence also appears important to health. And the question now is, what, if anything, can or should be done about it? Okay? And so, of course, we have to remember this is a very complicated issue, because for many of these people, this may represent long-term relational ambivalence, okay? And so may be quite complicated. So that's what always scares me when I think about doing interventions. I had a very nice conversation with Wolfgang about intervention research. But it always scares me because it's so complicated, especially for these more long-term relationships. But we have thought about it because I do think that's an area we'd like to move in the future. And so whenever I talk to the popular press about this work, there's always two things we talk about. Okay? So they always want to know, what should we do about these ambivalent ties if they look bad for your health? And overwhelmingly, they want me to say this. Like, we should just get rid of these ties, right? They're bad for us. Let's get rid of them, toss them to the curb. And maybe, okay? But of course, I mean, there are conditions under which that's very difficult, of course, right? And so I always tell them, well, it might work for less important or densely connected network members. Okay, maybe that might be an option. And in fact, there's good evidence across the lifespan that that may occur in older adults, according to social-emotional selectivity theory, for example. That people start to winnow their relationships to the closest, although some of those close relationships are still sources of ambivalence, but you might get less of that as people discard those relationships. But I think for more important network members, especially like when you think about spousal ambivalence, that's very difficult, okay? And may cause other problems like a decrease in financial status, conflict, et cetera. And so, and even for more densely connected network members like friendship circles, that might create problems as well. So maybe three of you hang out all the time, all of a sudden you decide, I'm ambivalent towards that one, and I don't want to see that person. That's going to cause some conflict within the relationships that exist, okay? So it's not always my first choice, although I certainly am willing to entertain that possibility. But it's not always my first choice to think about how to intervene here. That would be quite an intervention. I'll teach people how to get rid of their relationships. The way I like to think about it more now, maybe because I don't have as much data, and so we're just thinking about this, I'm optimistic about our chances of helping people, and that is that maybe you can help them to cope and resolve ambivalence in that relationship, okay? And so that's where I always end up heading when I talk to people in the press, that I think this is probably a more viable option that we should think about first. And there are a couple of ways we can think about this. One is traditional cognitive behavioral stress management, and the other, of course, is marital therapy, okay? However, when I think about my ideal intervention for ambivalence reduction, I think it needs to be specific to relationships, okay? And it needs to work across diverse network members, because it's not just the spouse people feel ambivalent towards, it's their friends, it's their family members, et cetera. Okay, so it needs to work much more generally across people's relationships. And so one thing we started thinking about is the potential of using what's called loving kindness meditation. How many people have heard of loving kindness meditation? Okay. Wow, that's a lot. Usually I get less. Basically, loving kindness is a contemplative meditation-based method for increasing feelings of love, connection, and caring for the self and others, including more conflicted relationships. Okay? And in LKM, individuals are first asked to quietly focus on their heart region. Okay? And you think about a relationship that you feel unconditionally positive towards, and usually it's a young child. Okay? And those feelings are usually talked about as feeling warm and connected. Okay? And over time through meditation, what you do is generalize that feeling to other more conflicted or negative relationships. Okay? And LKM, there's not a whole lot of data on it, but it appears to simultaneously increase relationship positivity and decrease relationship negativity, which would be perfect for ambivalence, by changing people's perceptions of relationships and also by fostering better interpersonal interactions. So at the perceptual level, it may change, but it also fosters people interacting with those individuals in a more positive way as well. Okay. So we did a small pilot study, primarily because we're trying to get some money from NIH to fund a larger study on this topic. And one thing they told us was that we needed pilot data, okay, which I guess was a fair question. And so we had 11 participants just to show we could do or run some people through this intervention. We had 11 participants. They had a 6-week intervention. We used the same LKM protocol by Barb Fredrickson, her JPSP article, probably the largest LKM intervention to date, but they only looked at mental health outcomes. Okay? What we want to look at ultimately are physical health outcomes. And they were asked to practice at least 5 days a week. Now, 9 out of 11 completed our workshop, which wasn't bad actually in terms of retention rate. And on average, they meditated less than we told them, but they did meditate when they did about 25 minutes a day. Okay? And we just looked at some simple, we didn't have any health measures here because it was a really quick pilot study, but we looked at replicating some prior research on basic relationship processes as well as mental health. And consistent with that, we did find that LKM was associated with an increase in general perceptions of support. This is Sheldon Cohen's ISL. So general perceptions of support were increased. Global measure, test of negative social exchanges is a global measure of social negativity or negative interactions. That was decreased. And depression levels were decreased as well, and satisfaction with life slightly increased. Okay? Of course, we're primarily interested in what happens in terms of our conceptual model, in terms of ambivalent, aversive, and supportive ties. And I want to show you first their baseline data. Okay? So essentially, people had the baseline data on the SRI, and they completed the SRI with the same people. Okay? So we know where they're rating the same relationships over time. And you can see at baseline that this looks quite different from what I showed you earlier. Okay? In that there's only a quarter of the people roughly who were rated as supportive, a higher level of people rated as ambivalent, and a relatively higher number too rated as aversive. Okay? And so we think what's happening, of course, is there's some selection here. People are reading, this is a study on relationships. Okay? And of course, the people who have poor quality relationships are the ones who are probably volunteering for this study. Okay? And I think there's probably no way to get around that. We just have to acknowledge that there's some selection going on here. So whether or not it might generalize to more people's everyday relationships, for people who don't have troubled relationships and all that goes with that, we're not certain. So here's some pre and post changes, but they're certainly in the direction that we would predict, okay, with the largest effect being for ambivalent ties, and that is, on average, ambivalent ties were decreased as a function of LKM, supportive ties were slightly increased, and aversive ties were decreased as well. Okay? Although they're certainly not as big as on the general measures of global relationship processes. We did some internal analyses as well, and we found that decreases in ambivalent ties were related to lower levels of negative interactions and higher satisfaction with life. Increases in supportive ties were related to decreases in depression, negative interactions, as well as increases in satisfaction with life. Okay? Now, of course, this is a small single-arm study, okay? But it was consistent with prior research in the sense that LKM fostered better general relationship processes as well as some mental health outcomes. Okay, that was pretty consistent and consistent with the prior literature. It's really clear to us, however, that LKM results in smaller changes in perceptions of specific network members, and that, I think, highlights the complexity of people's individual relationships, and the fact that it is quite dyadic. Okay, it's not just what you do, it's what the other person does as well. But these LKM-based changes in specific network members appear related to mental health outcomes. And the thing we've been playing around that we went back in with our grant and argued for after we saw these pilot data is perhaps we can increase the effect size associated with this by focusing on couples, loving kindness meditation in couples. Okay? And that would have a lot of advantages because first of all, it could potentially improve that important relationship between individuals, but also it would help them deal with their own relationships. And so as I showed you, in some cases, the networks of people of your spouse may have an impact on you as well. And so by focusing on dyads or married couples, that might be the best way to disseminate it across the social network in ways that are health relevant. Okay, so in general, I think positive and negative relationship processes are among the most reliable psychosocial predictors of health outcomes. The first line of research we were doing suggests the importance of also examining their joint influences on health, especially ambivalence, and taking a dyadic approach. Okay, and in phase 2, I mean, there's still a lot of work we need to do on the broad conceptual model of ambivalence that we've just developed. Okay, especially linking the sociological literature with the more psychological and health psychology literature. So we're still doing that work, but we also want to think about validating conceptually appropriate intervention strategies for trying to reduce ambivalence. Okay, and we think LKM holds promise, although we certainly need to increase the effect size on individual network members, perhaps through dyadic approaches. Okay, so thank you.